I'm going to start with good news for anyone who's not wholly enamoured of chemistry. How many people are not great chemistry lovers? Ooh, one. Yeah, one. Great. Two. Okay. It's hard to confess that in an environment like this. It's interesting. The periodic table does not exist, except mainly its best home is quizzes, really. Does anyone know which element has atomic number 69? Okay, good. Or which element is directly above thallium? No, close. It's indium, in fact. Good, I'm very glad you didn't know that, because that's pointless knowledge. Periodic table doesn't really matter in the sense that people formulate those sorts of questions about it, but the elements do, and what I'm trying to do really is to reclaim the elements and to show that they don't belong in chemistry labs, but they belong to all of us. And I begin this book with my sort of childhood attempt to construct a 3D real singing, dancing periodic table by getting samples of as many of the elements as I could, which involve crushing dead light bulbs and snipping out the little tungsten filaments and learning that certain foreign coin was made of nickel, and so shaving or filing, I suppose, the nickel off that. And in one particularly dodgy thing, taking the ends off dead mercury batteries and scooping out the insides and distilling the mercury off from that, which was great fun and very rewarding, but not something really people would recommend now. So periodic tables isn't a collection of elements, but it's a collection of our ideas about the elements, really. And just want to say, why the elements are for all. And so if you're interested in art, for example, you should know that about the materials that produce the unique colours that artists seek out that are importantly dependent on certain elements. If you're interested in finance, you need to know why, when times are tough, we still retreat to gold. Why that one element? It's entirely a cultural decision. Gold has no intrinsically greater worth than any other element in a chemical sense. If you're interested in consumerism and psychology and behaviour and so on, you might be interested to know why titanium is a good word for branding high-tech products, for now at least, and what the next good element word for branding things might be in the future. If you're interested in geography and history and industry, you might be interested to know that why there are places named after the elements, such as boron, California, and cobalt, Idaho, as well as elements named after places. And one of the things I describe in the book is I do this slightly quixotic voyage to Ytterby in Sweden, which is the place where it's the single place that gave its name to the most elements. It gave its name to about 6 or 7 of the chemical elements, including ytterbium and yttrium, that were found in the minerals at that one site. And if you're interested in literature and language, you need to be alive, as the best writers are, to the symbolic and metaphoric power of the elements. And I'll give some examples of that later on. So what I've tried to do is to sort of to reassemble the periodic table as a cultural anthropologist might, looking at the elements as we've come to understand them through their appearance and their handling them, and hence how they've got meanings in metaphor and literature and the arts. And my personal journey through the elements took me to mines and artist studios and factories and cathedrals, and down to the sea to make iodine and various other places. I recreated, like the iodine, a few early experiments with very varying degrees of success to try and make a few of the elements for myself. There is a sort of problem with chemistry, or people have talked about there being a problem with chemistry. It's something I'll come back to slightly at the end. And the book I've absorbed myself into for a very enjoyable year was not the sort of project that was greatly encouraged at school, and still less at university. And as I spoke to the various people I visited, for the book, I got a sense of chemistry's being in a somewhat dire predicament, having become almost a clandestine activity. So, alchemy may be discredited and gone, but the science of the elements seems to have gained, in some ways, rather little respect or respectability. And chemistry's heroes and heroines are neglected, and the subject, more worryingly, is increasingly taught hypothetically in schools, with experiments often no longer performed either by a pupil or a teacher, but simply described or seen on a DVD. And at the same time, of course, in the home and in the environment, chemicals have become things to be feared, things with inverted commas around them, things to be kept in their place under the kitchen sink, and treated with fear and trepidation. And I felt some of this directly as I was working on the book. I did try to inquire, at least after getting samples of various of the elements, and it led you to some very odd places. You can no longer, as far as I could see, go into a dispensing chemist and ask for compounds that you could when I was a child, but you can still find elements if you know where to look. So you can buy sulfur in a garden shop. You can buy great big lumps of magnesium at a ship's chandler. And you can buy antimony in its sulfide form, at least, highly poisonous, very nasty stuff. Don't really want to let people have it, but at a good artist supplier. So, as I say, there's this sort of clandestine, hidden nature to chemistry. I visited a fireworks factory that had, no sign to advertise its presence whatsoever. It was sort of hidden behind a hedge off a lay-by, off a road in the middle of the country, sort of like a secret military establishment. And I also heard from academics who'd been driven out of their urban laboratories to remote waste ground to perform some of their experiments. And all this seemed to me an odd way to increase scientific knowledge and spread understanding, and just sort of confirmed my belief that the universal elements should belong to all of humanity. So what I do is I write about 40 or so of the elements that I found have sort of cultural stories. I wouldn't claim that dysprosium or technetium or whatever has a great cultural story to tell, but if you know it, do tell me. But I picked a variety of elements, and I'll just sort of run through a few of those, hopefully an illustrative variety, and hopefully that will show why they do indeed belong to all of us, and always have, and that we understand the elements above all in cultural ways. I just want to give you an example of the sort of some of the hands-on experience that this led me to. When I was doing English O-level, as it was then called, we read at great and tedious length Thomas Hardy's The Woodlanders, and that, among its various other woodland characters, includes charcoal burners. And I was quite interested in going and doing some charcoal burning. And I found this charcoal burner in the Dorset Woods, the very Dorset Woods where Hardy's novel is set, who makes charcoal for people's barbecues and so on, and gave me this great rant about how actually most of the barbecue fuel in this country is imported from Brazil, where it's burnt up rainforests rather than sustainable stuff that such as he was gathering. Anyway, so I went and spent a morning getting incredibly dirty, breaking up charcoal and so on, emptying this kiln, well, not that kiln because that's hot, but another kiln. And one of the things this led me to do was also to explore the link between the sort of itinerant lifestyle of the charcoal burner and the Italian revolutionist group called the Carbonari, Carbonari being the Italian for charcoal burners. So these guys name themselves after charcoal burners because of the particular qualities of that lifestyle, which in turn stems from the particular qualities of properties of that element. It's much more economic and sensible to burn the charcoal hidden in the woods than to take the wood out of the woods and to where the charcoal is ultimately going to be needed, because you save a lot of weight in transport. But then this in turn gives the carbon charcoal burners a kind of marginal status in the culture. So that was an example of a sort of hands-on experience. More often, of course, I was in the library, and there's not much sort of written about how we know the elements culturally, and sometimes what was written at all was definitely accidental. And perhaps the greatest moment of serendipity was when I came across a book that described, well, when I came across, first of all, knowledge that there was this naval ship called HMS Sulphur. And then I found that, to my great joy, there was a huge record of its round-the-world voyage made in the 1830s. And by chance, or not, who knows, that this voyage, which was recounted in great detail, included numerous sulphurous episodes. So they stopped in Hawaii, for example, and went hiking up the volcanoes, and they let off gunpowder charges to create light flashes because they were doing metrical things, measuring distances and longitude and so on. And they got caught up in, or drafted into, I suppose I should say, the Opium Wars. So they were using gunpowder in anger there. And they brought back from their voyage, and these were in 3 or 4 big, heavy, beautiful illustrated volumes, in addition to this record of the voyage, masses of flora and fauna from around the world, some of which was sort of exotic sulphur-feeding flora and fauna. And all this is recounted by the happily named Captain Belcher. So there's a slight sulphurous aspect there too. And I don't think they ever realised the connection between the name of their ship and all this sulphur that was kind of all around them all the time. But I've kind of made that into a story in the book. I learnt about all the elements that have been considered as money, gold and silver, of course, and copper and platinum. But did you know, for example, that Glenn Seaborg fancied that plutonium, the element he discovered, might be adopted as a new currency standard? He seemed to have missed some other large points about plutonium, but anyway. Or that of all the substances that might have been chosen for the fluorescent dyes used as security features of euro banknotes, the element, if we had a UV light, we could do this, I'm sorry, but banks have UV lights, but we don't. The fluorescent feature in this is based on the element europium. There's no great reason for it to be. There's lots of other compounds you could base it on, but someone somewhere in some European institution had the sort of sense of fun to make sure that it was europium that was chosen for the job. So I want to talk first really about lead. It's one of the dozen or so elements known to the ancients, so it's one that you think might have a cultural story. It's not precious, and it's not in many ways even very useful, so maybe its cultural story is a bit kind of weirder than some obvious candidates like gold, for example. Rodin's famous sculpture of the Thinker, it's cast in bronze, and the pose, as you can see, has him leaning forward impossibly far. I've tried this, and I fell off my chair. And the reason he can hold that pose, according to X-ray studies that have recently been done on the statue, is that he has a big lead weight in his bottom. And lead is the element we most associate with gravity, and that's physical gravity, fishing weights or whatever, not that it's used for that anymore, or intellectual gravity, serious thoughts. Lead weighs heavily, and it falls heavily. And when it falls heavily, it falls decisively, which means that it's also associated with fortune-telling. The Romans made use of lead dice, and Shakespeare was aware of all these associations to do with lead. And in The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare's words are very carefully chosen to shed light on each element's character, and so on the character of Portia's 3 suitors in that story. So the 3 caskets, the 3 suitors, 3 caskets, 1 lady to be won, and the caskets are made of gold, silver, and lead. So a very simple setup, completely artificial, but hey-ho. The gold casket is inscribed, "Who chooseth me shall gain what many men desire." And the silver one says, "Who chooseth me shall get as much as he deserves." So they, yeah, right. So they both appear to offer some kind of deal, but you're not quite sure what. And the inscription on the lead casket is a bit different. It recognizes really only the uncertainty of the world. It says, "Who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath." So lead is definitely still associated with fate here, but true fate in a way, not the sort of hokum of charlatan fortune-telling and prediction. And the first two suitors to appear in the play, Portia calls them deliberate fools, meaning that they deliberate too much, are the princes of Morocco and Aragon. And they judge they can't really afford life's gamble. They prefer what they think is a clear trade, the gold and silver, even if the terms aren't clear. So the vain one, Morocco, chooses the gold, and in a long, boring speech, Aragon sort of makes this elaborate calculation which explains why he's chosen the silver. And the worthy suitor, Bassanio, as seen in this film, rationalizes the choice differently, and in a world, quote, "still deceived with ornament," he rejects both gold and silver and chooses the lead casket. Now, all three suitors have been guided in their choice by their perceptions of the relative metal's worth, although it's notable that Portia has been completely scrupulous in never ascribing any value to any of them. So she's let them make a completely free choice, or dig their own hole, as you prefer. And gold is predictably identified by the three men as the most desirable metal, whether simply or in kind of more devious ways. And silver is identified with purity and also with common coin and in different ways. And the three guys have called lead dull and base and meagre in turn, but only Bassanio is the one not put off by its ordinariness, or by the unstated fact that, as audiences of Shakespeare will have known then, that one of the element's few genuine applications is for lining sarcophagi, so it's there in death. So when Bassanio chooses the lead casket over the shiny gold and silver ones, he's acknowledging his own mortality and that of his beloved Portia, and that's something the other suitors completely fail to do. One of the things I did in the book was lead is actually still used for fortune-telling today in parts of Germany and the Czech Republic. They do this thing called Bleigießen, which means lead pouring. And what you do, it's like a sort of Central European version of tea leaf reading. You melt some lead and you pour bits of it into cold water, and from the shapes in which it solidifies, you deduce your fortune. So if you pour it in and it comes out the shape of a boat, you might go on a voyage or something like that. And slightly surprisingly, you can go on Amazon or whatever and buy kits for this today that still contain real lead, which is slightly surprising given the way lead has been prohibited in artists' paints and elsewhere. And just to show you how current this still is, this is a cartoon from a German magazine, and it shows Angela Merkel and some Mandarin from some European financial institution. I don't know who this is. If anyone does, let me know. And they've just poured the lead. You can see the little burner they've melted the lead with. They poured the lead into that bowl of water, and they've pulled out this shape of a thumbs down, and Angela's looking worried. So Bleigießen is alive and well. Mercury is another ancient element that it's difficult to find uses for, but it too has its meanings. In Jean Cocteau's film Orpheus enters the underworld in pursuit of Eurydice by passing through a mirror of Mercury. And it's a fantastic piece of cinematic sleight of hand. Orpheus goes up to this large dressing mirror, and he puts on latex gloves, which is interesting in itself because although it's presented as a magic kind of preparatory ritual, it in fact shows that Jean Cocteau, this amazingly avant-garde guy, was actually pretty worried about health and safety, which was remarkable for 1930s. He puts on these gloves and he goes up to this mirrored surface. And his guide says, with these gloves, you will be able to pass through the mirror like water. And he puts his hands to it, and nothing happens. He's just met by the resistance of the hard surface. And so he's told, il s'agit de croire, you must believe. And then instantly he believes, it seems, and he pushes again, and his hand goes through the Mercury surface, and he begins to pass into the underworld. And as that happens, the camera shot switches, and we see an overhead shot, and he's seen from above, disappearing through this mirror. And what's interesting about this, it's axiomatic that we cannot know the underworld, of course, until we ourselves leave the world. And so for this reason, I think Cocteau sought for his divide between the two, something that would be a total optical barrier, but something nevertheless physically penetrable. And the setup required 1/2 ton of mercury, and that seems like an awful lot until you remember that the metal is so dense that lead will float on its surface. And 1/2 ton of mercury actually is only enough to make a full-size sort of bedroom mirror, dressing mirror, about 1 centimetre deep. So they made this pool of mercury, mirror-sized, centimetre deep, and of course you can't arrange for that to stand vertically, so this is where all the cinematic cleverness comes in, and the reason why he changes the shot from just the hand disappearing into the liquid a tiny bit to this cunning overhead shot where you no longer see the mercury. And Cocteau might have used milk or paint or something cheaper, basically, to achieve the same effect. But I think mercury was well chosen as being the only liquid that was able to provide a perfect reflection of the world he was leaving, as well as that impenetrable barrier to the world he was entering. I should have shown you a picture of that. There we go. There's his hand, his gloved hand disappearing into the thing. Putting on, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this film, but I think there are clips of it on YouTube. The bit where he puts on the glove is absolutely amazing because it's done in some kind of accelerated stop motion. So the glove, if you try to put latex gloves on and take them off again, they're a real pain. But the glove just goes like that onto his hand as another sort of magical cinematic moment. So Cocteau's use of mercury as a gateway to another world might seem highly original, artist, of course, but in fact it's just a modern twist in a sort of long and universal tale. And the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, who unified the country in 221 BC, is said by legend to lie buried beneath a grassy hill near Xi'an in the Shanxi province of northern China. And the historian Sima Qian, writing a century or so after the emperor's death, describes a vast bronze-lined chamber with a jewelled ceiling representing the heavens, and in it a fantastic model of the emperor's palace and his capital city, Shanyang, lying all around it, and the entire empire beyond that. This is the region of China where the Terracotta Army and other treasures were unearthed in recent decades. This is not it. This is a computer graphic imagination of it. And through this model landscape are said to run channels of mercury that represent the 100 great rivers of China. And Sima writes of the mechanisms that pump the mercury around, supposedly maintaining a continuous flow to symbolize the eternal lifeblood of the emperor. The Chinese use mercury a lot, of course. Mercury sulfide or cinnabar is the basis of the traditionally auspicious red colour used so much in China. And dead bodies were rouged with this substance to make them look healthy. And, of course, as in the West, mercury was widely used as a medicine and was thought to be a direct way, a medicinal way to immortality when administered to a person. Because of its sort of quick-running nature, it was so lively that it must convey immortality. And so That's why the Chinese emperors were buried with it. And in Qin's case, also, it's thought that his blood probably contained mercury at the time of his death because he was taking mercury pills in the hope of obtaining immortality. So they haven't excavated Qin's tomb, but they have carried out various non-destructive tests at the site, and including chemical analysis of soil samples, and they've revealed levels of mercury well above the normal. So this sort of ritual use of mercury might seem a historical footnote, but again, it recurs, and this is back to the more modern period, 20th century. This is a work of art by Alexander Calder. It's called Mercury Fountain. And it was made for the Spanish Pavilion at the World Expo. The Spanish Pavilion at the Paris Exposition in 1937. And he got the commission from the short-lived Republican government in the midst of Spain's civil war. And the sculpture went on display in the same space as Picasso's painting Guernica. And Calder's work is less kind of angry and obvious in its reference to the conflict. The mobile sculpture, it consists of three or four metal plates that are balanced and gimbaled so that they can move. And then the mercury is pumped up through this little tube at the left-hand side onto the top plate. And as it loads the top plate tips, and some of the mercury dribbles off into lower plates that have these sort of steps in it. And then the mercury settles into the pool. And the mercury is the key to the meaning of the work. It came, like most of the world's mercury at that time, from the cinnabar deposits at a place called Almaden near Madrid. And it was a strategic location, obviously, because so much mercury came from there. It was repeatedly attacked by Franco's insurgents. And Calder's work commemorates the miners who successfully held off the nationalist onslaught. And I like to think of each sort of mercury droplet as representing an individual who at one moment bands together with others, coalesces into a larger mass, and then is broken apart again by sort of forces beyond their control, perhaps, and then finally is sort of reunited in death in this big pool at the bottom. However it's interpreted, I think it's one of the most sort of imaginative war memorials ever devised. And Almaden means the mine in Arabic. And this site was well known to the Arabs who ruled Spain from the 8th to the 15th centuries. And Calder's Fountain acknowledges this history as well. Arab gardens in Spain were often adorned with mercury pools. So you could trail your fingers through a pool of mercury and it would ripple the surface and create dapples of bright sunlight on the surfaces in a courtyard, for example. Not to be recommended today. But actually, strangely, in 1937, people spent their time throwing coins onto this mercury. You could get right up to it. And the same sculpture is now behind in a sort of sealed glass box at the Miro Foundation in Barcelona. So it's interesting, I think, to consider the cultural journey of mercury from an element of the highest sort of ornamental and symbolic significance to one that's now all but expunged from every aspect of our lives. And I don't know if it's actually illegal to own, it's illegal to sell a barometer or thermometer using mercury, I think. I don't think it's illegal to own one yet. And we have fears about mercury escaping into the atmosphere from cremated people's fillings. So it's all really a far cry from 1937 when Calder kept 50 litres of mercury in reserve to replenish the artwork if any was lost by people splashing it about. I'm not sure I even want to go to the place where it stood in 1937 because the soil is probably... Anyway, who knows. I wonder if I've got time to do tin. Let's have a look. Tin's another element with a lot of cultural baggage, another old element. And unlike mercury and lead, it's more usable. It has its own kind of distinctive advantages. Unlike gold and silver, it's cheap. And unlike lead, it's shiny and bright. And it's strong enough to make useful items, but soft enough that these articles can be made by anybody, more or less. It requires no great artisan skill because the stuff melts at a very low temperature. And tin, of course, is also our metallic shorthand for something that's cheaper and nasty. In a way, Henry Ford's affordable car was the Tin Lizzie, and low-value coinage is called tin, and we have tin pot dictators and so on. This is a reference to Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, a sculpture in Copenhagen. And the story ends tragically with the tin soldiers being consumed in a fire, along with the paper ballerina that he loves. And raking the ashes later, a maid finds that the soldier has melted into the shape of a heart. And what the story, I think, sort of says is that, you know, tin is disposable, like all the elements. On the other hand, it's also indestructible. It's both easily cast and yet easily recast. And there's a significant hint of the soldier's fate at the beginning of the story, because he's already different from the other 23 soldiers in the box, because the tin was running out when he was made, and so he has only one leg. So the ease of working made tin the commonplace metal. Bronze was reserved for weapons, and gold and silver for church and court. And ironware, as I say, required the services of a blacksmith. But anybody could work a piece of tin into something useful. And it was made into plates and jugs and tankards and ornaments and musical instruments and jewellery and so on. And as the phrase tin ear indicates, tin was also used for making prostheses, so that because you could easily follow the sort of intricate shape of a body part, when some part was damaged to the ravages of the pox or whatever, you could get a tin replacement. And I found a very pleasing contemporary example of how culture draws on the meaning of the elements deriving directly from their chemical and physical properties. In Rose Tremaine's novel, The Road Home, some of you may have read it, it describes the experience of a chap called Lev, who's an Eastern European migrant who travels to Britain for work. And Rose Tremaine opposes two elements, maybe sort of almost unconsciously, sodium and tin in the story. And so Lev's bus crosses into Austria from the east during the night and stops for petrol under a sodium sky, which becomes a sort of recurrent image. And meanwhile, back in Poland, his grandmother supports the family by making jewellery out of tin. And sodium in this story signifies the modern and technological sophistication in the urban West, and tin speaks of home in the rural East of simple crafts. And tin, like Lev in the story, is compliant and cheap, but nevertheless fundamentally honest and decent. He's bent by forces beyond his control, like the steadfast tin soldier, but he remains true to his roots. Sodium, on the other hand, is a deceitful element, and it's the colour of its emission spectrum that makes it so. I suggested a moment ago that Shakespeare was a bit of a chemist, and now I'd like to persuade you that T.S. Eliot was a spectroscopist. In The Wasteland, he presents a vivid image of a nail-studded ship's timber, which is in flames, and he describes it as, quote, fed with copper, burned green and orange. And the green is from the copper flame colour that it produces, the spectrum, and the orange, of course, is from the sodium in the sea salt. And the colour is most familiar to us from streetlights, of course. And ever since they were introduced in the 1930s, writers have included this light and made sort of particular use of it. And Jean-Paul Sartre and J.G. Ballard, Anthony Burgess, James Coetzee, Will Self, Tom Wolfe, among just some of the examples I found of writers who've done this. And what's interesting is they all use the element by tacit agreement in the same way as Rose Tremaine does too, to convey an idea of urban dystopia. It's not a cheerful colour. and the poet laureate John Betjeman called sodium light yellow vomit spewed out from concrete gallows. So very negative perceptions of it. And the reason why, this is my only technical slide, the reason why it works in that way is literally because of its spectrum, which looks green up there, but it looks yellow here. Because sodium, the bottom spectrum here, gives off only yellow light, and more to the point, yellow light of one particular frequency, 589 nanometers, it means that everything that it illuminates only reflects back that color light, regardless of what color it is. And so all the true color of objects is washed out, which is why I said it was a deceitful element a moment ago. And actually sodium light is in remarked contrast to gas light, which came before sodium light. And when gaslight was greeted culturally by writers and so on, it was regarded as a sort of a marvel and a good thing, and its white light was regarded in particular as sort of truthful in an important sense. Now, sodium's a relatively new element, discovered only 200 years ago or so by Humphrey Davy. And you'd expect the old elements, those known as antiquity, like the ones I started with, to be part of our culture. But I think the important thing is that many of the newer elements are there too. And all the elements have this potential. They're all on a journey into our culture. So I just want to move on to neon, which is a century or so newer than sodium. And as you saw from its spectrum a moment ago, that's neon's the top line there. So its spectrum is more over in the pure red areas with some other minority sort of colours. And neon is found culturally in some of the same places as sodium, of course, but it has a subtly different set of associations. I mean, it's urban and sophisticated in a way, but it also has a kind of empty promise at the heart of it. And so if you look at novels like Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita or American road movies, neon is often used in that way. And the other thing is that neon is always used for urgent messages. It was too red and lurid and unfortunate for sort of domestic lighting, so it quickly was adopted for advertising almost exclusively, and it's used to advertise important urgent things like sex and drink and kebabs. And artists have noticed this and have sort of made a nonsense of this urgency. And I love this work. This is by an artist called Tim Etchells, and the idea that you've got an urgent message but you've still got time to make a neon sign about it is I like. Another artist, Fiona Banner, has noticed how neon signs tend to shout in capital letters, this does too, and always seem to leave out the punctuation that you use in proper English. So she's made a set of punctuation marks to sort of complete the set. And this is from a series of artworks called Bones. They're her own making, which is why they're a bit wobbly. They're not just instructions to a commercial neon sign maker. And these simple sort of glowing marks taken out of context suddenly begin to have interesting shapes that sort of look like primitive weapons found on an archaeological dig or something, maybe. So how long have I got? I tell you, yeah. We're doing okay, aren't we? So we've gone from the ancient elements to sodium 200 years ago to neon 100 years ago. And I want to finish with an even newer element. It's about 60 or 70 years old, I suppose, just to convince you that any element can become part of our culture. And we don't even need to see it with our own eyes for that to be so. And I briefly worked at a place called the Atomic Energy Research Establishment in Harwell. It was my only job in a laboratory, and I was charged with transferring solutions of plutonium, dilute I hope, through columns to see how much of the plutonium was absorbed by a potential absorbing substance, so the stuff could be disposed of safely. And plutonium is an element sort of fundamentally equal and equivalent to all the others, in a sense, in purely physical and chemical terms, of course. And yet, I think it's become demonized, and in my sort of scheme of things, plutonium is the new sulfur, if you like. So sulfur is, as brimstone is the sort of element of evil and destruction and bad things in the Bible, and plutonium is now our kind of demonic element, because we know that it was developed for the atomic bomb and its nuclear warfare is dependent on it, and so on. So, as I said at the beginning, I was interested in returning to this project of building my own periodic table, and it's entirely legitimate that I should get a sample of plutonium for this table as well, since it's just one of the elements like all the others. So I was faced with this question of how to get hold of some. And the Atomic Energy Research Establishment was my first port of call, which of course has been shut down, taken over and then shut down, not least because of leakages into the environment, which is ironic as well as unfortunate given what their job was to in the first place. And so that didn't work. But then I did a bit of Googling, and I found an American nuclear laboratory called Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and they had an email contact number that was isotopes@ornl.gov. And so I wrote to them and said, I'm really trying to build my periodic table. I'm terribly interested. Could you send me a small bit of plutonium for it? And predictably got a very short answer back. So that didn't work either. But I did eventually find it, and about half a mile from here. And I brought it with me today, in fact, I think. So you might want to have a look at this. It's a squirty thing. It's like an atomizer. You can put some on behind your ears. And it's homeopathic plutonium. So, and they seemed very vague as to what it was actually for, but they were pretty sure it's for something really serious. So, do we want to do questions? Yeah, people like questions? Is that good? I just want to finish very quickly with just a sort of slight observation about as I sort of started with this thing about the predicament of chemistry. And since I studied it, the subject seems to have undergone several sort of crises of identity, and it's lost popular ground, perhaps, and it doesn't have a David Attenborough or a Brian Cox, you might argue. But also I think it's been sort of rebranded, and it's surfaced as other sexier things. So molecular biology and nanotechnology and forensic science, material science, molecular gastronomy, all of these things are just chemistry by another name. And so in a way I'm still slightly surprised to find that chemistry is so sort of firmly rooted as unshakable as a core school and university subject. I don't know how often they revise these things, but I think it's been that way for a century under something. I don't know. As it happens, as Felicity said, I've just been writing a book about the human body and the ways we understand that culturally as well as scientifically. And one of the things that struck me doing that is that the subject of anatomy, human anatomy, is no longer really taught. It's dropped off university medical courses because there's too much work to do about cell biology or genetics or whatever it is, and it's kind of slipping out of the school curriculum too. And so I sort of wonder if chemistry might be going the same way. And my book has sort of been seen as an attempt to revitalize chemistry. I'm not too worried about that. Maybe if that's its effect, then fine. But my greater concern is, as I say throughout, to realize that the elements are all around us and that we own them, and they're not going to go away regardless of what we call that particular field of study. Okay, thank you very much. I want my plutonium back because you might get arrested if you leave the room with it.